Okay, welcome everybody. Very excited today. We have a guest from the University of Kansas, Professor Silvia Park, a wonderful author who recently published her debut novel, Luminous, is here to talk to us about AI and art. Professor Park, so when I think about your writing, um, your writing is very literary, but it has a relationship kind of to science fiction in the same way I think that like um, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's writing, which amazingly literate, also has like a foot into fantasy, right? Like you write about technology and I guess much about artificial intelligence as a way to kind of explore human emotion and the human struggle. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why it is that you pick specifically kind of that area uh, to frame your stories, why it is that you pick, robots and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting. But thank you for the introduction. I I think it's really interesting that you bring up, Marquez, because oftentimes when people think about like, magical realism in Latin America, they think of it sort of as a movement.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there are quite a few theories about how magical realism sort of became that mode of in that movement because it was the only way for them to, or one of the ways for them to really understand the post-colonial existence, because reality had been so disturbed at a historical level that magical realism sort of became the channel to be able to grasp their own reality. And realism was simply not enough of a medium to channel that. And I wonder if something similar might be going on because I feel like so many of us now feel like we live in a science fiction existence, or some people like take it a step further. They say we live in a dystopian existence, but I definitely do think that technology has just warped our sense of reality,
Mm-hmm.
upended a lot of just like what we take for granted about, present day security, but also just really blurred the future. So I ended up writing Luminous mainly during the pandemic, actually. So I had the idea and I started the premise. I started working on the premise before, like around 2019. And then it was really when the pandemic kicked in that I just really got to draft most of the book out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting because actually I finished the book and I'd sold it to a publisher before ChatGPT came out
Right.
and
Right.
and just started terrifying people and just started kind of, spreading everywhere. Particularly if anyone who's in academia right now, we know that they're now using ChatGPT and LLMs as sort of an institutional infiltration. They're really targeting universities. And I think it's because they want to now change the mode we work in. So I feel that, the period where I wrote that book, it wasn't necessarily, I wasn't trying to be, making any predictions because that's not really what science fiction is about. Science fiction is more about engaging with the past and the present and just reckoning with with the mistakes that we continue to make repeatedly throughout history.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. So when I think of science fiction, I have like a in my mind, and like you know, I'm just a math guy, so what do I know? But when I think about science fiction and I think about like the different subject matters that have been popular throughout time, like in the after World War II, you had a lot of zombies and vampires and stuff that were brought on by radiation, right? That was the plot point. And after in the 90s, you had a bunch of zombies and stuff that were brought on by genetic experimentation and things, right? And for each of these, the monsters, the bad guy, the main sciency plot seems to be a reflection of what society is fearing
Yeah.
at that moment, right? And so we see that that changes as society's greatest fear for the advancement of science
Yeah.
continues. And like you said, the beauty of science fiction is that we see that even if it continues, the mistakes that we make are the same mistakes that we've always made. And I guess now, based like largely on your writing and people like you, that biggest fear is AI,
Mm,
right? Um, so I'm wondering if you know you, you write very, I guess, lovingly about the relationship that people maybe can have with this technology in a way that's not entirely fearful, right?
right.
You write in a way that's endearing, and like through reading your work, I feel hopeful for technology, right? Could you talk a little bit about kind of the place of hope in art, and specifically in art that maybe deals with AI?
Yeah. Well, I I do definitely tell my readers that I didn't write the darkest timeline when I was thinking about the future and our future relationship with artificial intelligence and with robots. Particularly, I feel like, for years and years, we've as humanity, we've been obsessed with recreating humanity, but
Yeah.
in a more perfect form. So that's why ever since going back to like Pinocchio, Frankenstein, like for centuries, we've had this strange urge to artificially create a human form that reflects our human self and our human intelligence, but is still other. And I think it's not just fear actually, because when you look at, yes, Frankenstein for sure embodies a lot of fear, but there's a lot of also empathy for the
Hmm.
monster.
Hmm.
And Pinocchio is entirely from the perspective of, a child that wants to be a real child and
Hmm.
is a complete brat, but like a real child.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that it's for centuries, we've actually acknowledged that it's not just fear, it's fascination. We're fascinated by recreating ourselves because, in some sort of twisted way, we think that we will have a better understanding of ourselves once we're able to recreate it in a like sort of a twisted mirror. But I think that hope is a really, I think it's lovely that you came away with that emotion. I feel that these characters who have relationships with robots, I was more interested in portraying a world that is a little bit different from the science fiction you just described, where oftentimes when we want to address what is an embodiment of our fear, a lot of these stories do top-down sort of, approach, meaning that if there's a zombie apocalypse, it just sweeps across the world. And if there is like, a robot or like the Terminator, it again, or the Matrix, it's often about societally we feel very helpless and we're now kind of like, facing the other and we have a reason to fear the other. But I was more interested in how the other has already infiltrated our society. Because actually,
Hmm.
I feel like that's just more likely what's going to happen. Without ourselves even realizing, like, think about how just like 20, 30 years ago, could you imagine how ubiquitous smartphones would be? The way phones are now parasitically embedded in our lives, and we actually might spend more time on our phones than we would, or an equal amount of time on our phones than we would sleeping.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's the way I approach. And I feel that that's also why what we fear because it's so seductive. And I
Yeah.
and I'm quite afraid of how AI makes things very, very easy. And
Hmm.
it'll continue to make things easy. And that's the reason why we essentially invite it into our homes like a vampire.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful. The yeah, so you said that you wrote from how the other would fear us, and right, for sure. But I also think about how the human characters, right, and that you write are so integrated
Yeah.
in with machines. And it's a vision of the future where, and it raises some interesting ethical questions. It's a vision of the future where the machines themselves are so beyond passing the Turing test.
Yes.
And humans themselves can be mostly machine, right?
Yeah.
And so I wonder when you see that, and particularly since you said that you're writing from this perspective of the other, if you think that this latest generation of AI, like, does it raise, I guess, ethical questions that you see, um, for like how how humans should handle our relationship with these machines.
Absolutely. So actually, I think one of the reasons why AI as a subject of fear and fascination is that, you know, with the other examples, like especially the zombie apocalypse, that just like it sweeps all of us. It affects all of us almost equally. As opposed to with technology, I think what's quite frightening about technology is that the earliest and fastest and most natural adopters of technology are children.
Mhm.
They're the ones who are going to just become increasingly more savvy with technology. So already we see this immense gap, right? Nowadays, we're starting to have a lot of fears about parenting and social media because we are seeing this generation gap between older generations, realizing that they no longer sort of speak the same language or understand the world that their children is immersed in. So
Mhm.
when I was working on the premise of my novel, I felt like there were already a lot of stories that really beautifully touch upon our relationship with robots more on a sort of equal plane, such as either robots as romantic partners or maybe robots like, you know, like where we're working in like the labor force, robots as
Mhm.
weapons and whatnot. But I was interested in what about our relationship between robots and children? Particularly because once robots now start to, artificial intelligence starts to really kind of spread across our society, it's the children who are going to have such immediate and primary contact because again, we will rely on artificial intelligence because of its ease, that it makes things convenient and I think, you know, when we think about our lives, one of the toughest things to do is to balance raising children.
Mhm.
So that was really the approach I wanted to go at. And I feel there's a seminal work by Isaac Asimov called Bobby, and it's one of the earliest sort of like iRobot stories
Mhm.
where we see the seductiveness between the child and the robot. And I think we see another version of that in Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro.
Mhm.
But I guess I kind of wanted to take a step further because usually these children, they get bored of these robots or they outgrow them. But
Right.
what happens when the child does not outgrow the robot? When the adult has now where the child becomes an adult and realizes that, you know, the relationships, these crucial relations they had formed since childhood were actually might have been artificial. So,
Right.
so that's actually why the characters show immense empathy for the other. But the book itself, I made a conscious choice of never writing from the other. I purposely did not include any perspective from the robots.
Mhm.
I wanted that to be sort of the ongoing dilemma because that is our current dilemma too, which is that
Yeah.
if robots ever gain sentience or self-knowledge or self-feeling, will we ever be able to recognize it?
Mhm. Yeah. So you know, it's so interesting to me that you bring up these points because it seems like this book was written in the past year, right? Like it could have been written in the past year because we're currently like, we're hearing stories of people that are using ChatGPT as a romantic partner, people that have started to use ChatGPT as a therapist. One of my colleagues in our school of psychology recently published a paper
Yeah.
on like just how bad ChatGPT is as a therapist. But the scary part was that despite the fact that it failed all of these, you know, professional standards, the people that were using it loved it.
Yeah.
Like they had true embodiment of emotion, like true emotion towards ChatGPT. Um, and so I think what this book does, which is what I think the greatest science fiction can do, is it gave it gives a prediction of, what's possible, right? It's close enough to where we are now that you feel like emotionally it's possible. And I think that that's what makes really wonderful art. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit in general, like beyond this book, um, how do you see other artists engaging kind of with this topic of technology and artificial intelligence in this moment that we're in?
Yes. I mean, first of all, I'm glad I wrote this book before all of this happened. It's, I think it would be a completely different challenge and a different book if I were to write about artificial intelligence right now.
Hmm.
Because even if like, let's say that what happens in my book might turn out to be accurate in the future, that wasn't my intention. I wasn't intending to predict. And that's mainly because I feel that artificial intelligence in fiction has a really long and rich history and is very different from AI in reality. Because
Hmm.
AI in reality is what I've now realized has become quite scary about AI in reality is that there is actually very little substance compared to the substance that we want to like cultivate in AI and fiction, where we imagine that, wow, these intelligence might actually be even beyond us, like we've seen with like, with Frankenstein, with the film Her, and all of these other works that contemplate what does it mean to be beyond human as well.
Hmm.
But I think the danger right now is that we are in some ways, and it's been fed actually by science fiction too, because I feel a lot of these tech CEOs, they took a lot of the language and fantasy of science fiction, artificial intelligence science fiction, and applied it to their own AI and hype it up.
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of the AI is regurgitation. It's about knowing how to repackage, regurgitate, and it just is a very, very, very shallow reflection. It's not, there's nothing behind that surface. And I
Hmm.
think that's quite frightening because it shows that there is so much data available for them to regurgitate. And of course, we know how that data was stolen, right? Because it was stolen. We can talk about easily about how, these LLMs, they stole thousands of books from authors who, shed years and tears and blood to, cultivate. And they just took it. And they took it with the excuse of, well, these books don't actually, they have no monetary value, is how they put it, because that's
Right.
how they see essentially the way they handle artificial intelligence. What is a way to draw as much monetary value out of AI? And I find that to be quite dangerous to position an intelligence that is masquerading as an intelligence and just thinking about how can we profit off of the people that these programs are targeted towards.
Well, that brings up a good point, and it's a good way for us to kind of segue into the another part of the discussion that I wanted to ask you about. So, there's the way that art engages with artificial intelligence, and you've been very good in talking about that. I thank you. And then separately, there's kind of the economics and of actually being an artist
Yeah.
in the era of artificial intelligence. Um, and I'm kind of wondering what you think overall. The other day I was at an event where one of the great abstract painters of the 20th century that's still alive, Pat Lipsky, was saying, somebody asked her about this, and she said, I think that the market for, and of course she was talking about visual art, but I think that the market for visual art right now is basically the strongest it's been in 30 years. I don't think this makes a difference. And I'm wondering, as a successful working artist yourself, um, do you see like AI drastically affecting kind of the future economic viability of art, or what, how do you see it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned Pat Lipsky. I know her son David Lipsky. He was
Hmm.
actually an instructor at NYU, which
Hmm.
but I feel that, oh yes, AI is definitely it's going to, because sadly the publishing industry is incredibly slow. That's why they jumped on the ebook bandwagon after Amazon had swept up, and it was like, again, it was a tech platform that jumped in first and knew how much this was going to upend the industry. So, yes, on one hand, there are like, certain core tenets of art that will remain preserved, but
Hmm.
I do fear that it's becoming smaller and smaller. I wonder, like, for example, are movie theaters now like sort of a pastime that's like opera, where
Right.
the ones who will go out to a theater and treat it as an experience are like the real like devotees, as opposed to now it's been as an entertainment form, it has to adapt and change to the fact that the consuming habits of it has completely drastically changed and within a shortened amount of time. In some ways, I feel they would really kind of point to the pandemic as escalating the streaming
Yeah,
wars. So yes, if we have even just like a pandemic completely change an industry, definitely AI is going to absolutely both ravage and transform and possibly, inspire an industry. It's I think that's why it's so frightening to people because they don't know what direction it's going to take. And odds are it's going to be a combination of all three. It's going to be both, it's going to be both devastating and perhaps inspiring.
yeah. You're talking about the streaming platforms and stuff and how they've already changed movies, and it just reminds me that somebody was asking Matt Damon if like he could um they could produce Good Will Hunting today, and he said absolutely not. Those mid-budget movies, there's no room for them anymore. That, like he said, the the industry has either gone to super cheap movies that you can make money on streaming or giant blockbuster movies. So I guess what you're saying is the same might happen for publishing also, that you lose whole chunks of the market, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wonder, I mean, I feel like right now artists are very reluctant to talk about how they're using or engaging with AI
Mm-hmm.
because the immediate sort of reaction within, within the artist community is backlash. Like if you're using AI, immediate backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me thinking, before our conversation, because have you read Richard Powers' Playground?
Mm-hmm. I have not.
Gosh, yeah. So this is a huge spoiler, but I mean, but Richard Powers as an author has always been really, really interested in AI, which is why he wrote Galatea 2.0 like a while back. But I feel that, after I read Playground, it made me wonder. Like I wondered, I mean, it was very unlikely because again, this book was published a bit early, but it started getting me thinking like, okay, how are writers and artists supposed to what is a relationship with AI, which is now a devouring force that is starting with replacing them? And I
Mm-hmm.
think, and it's starting to replace, they want to replace, I think, a lot of the so-called lower levels, the entry levels, because it's going to save money for, bigger institutions. But I guess that's why my biggest concern is for the younger generations and how are they going to incorporate AI into their lives? Because I do feel like if it kind of feels like the horse has already left the barn situation. We can't really close the door anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if younger generations are meant to now work with AI in order not to be replaced by AI, how is that going to affect our, not just our art, but all these other industries? But to focus on art, my concern is people are going to be more and more reluctant to do things that are hard and
Yeah.
that have very little immediate short-term gratification.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand that. So speaking of that, so like one of the ways that artists and intellectuals in general support our creation, our desire, our need, our drive to do things and to have a life of the mind is through, these other jobs, whether they're editorial jobs or like what you and I are doing right now, which is working for universities, teaching these kinds of things. So I too do worry about that. And I wonder, um, as a professor, if you have seen that aspect of your work become more difficult over the last few years.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think so. I teach both undergraduate and graduate students.
Mhm.
With my graduate students, not yet, because I feel like they completed a lot of their like their secondary education before LLMs started really hitting the market and
Right.
infiltrating sort of their education. And a lot of the graduate students, like they know this is what they want to do for life, so they're very, very serious about it. They treat it with this immense respect. And my undergraduate students is, I can't like single out anyone, but I do worry that for some of them, they're never going to have a chance to learn, respect the work. That it's going to be incredibly difficult and exhausting. But a trend that I have started seeing is that in the past, my undergraduate students would always have trouble with page length because usually they would
Mhm.
always submit more pages than, than we would allow. And I'd have to tell them, like split this up or trim it down. But I've started to see a trend where a lot of my undergraduate students are now submitting very, very short pieces. So it's very rare for these stories to even reach what I consider like the maximum length. And I wonder, is this a effect of artificial intelligence? Is this an effect of how our attention span has really transformed over the years? But so far, like with my small sample size, it's been very consistent.
Well, that's so interesting. Have you engaged with them on this topic and asked them? Um,
Yeah, they very much like, look at the ground and then they're just like, I just couldn't think of more or they
yeah,
say that, this is what they're used to writing. And I thought, interesting, is this what they're used to writing? And it made me think maybe it's because, we've read the articles, right, where they talk about how nowadays in not just school, but in universities, professors are no longer assigning full-length novels. They're
right.
only assigning excerpts.
Hmm.
And this is again a huge concern because it means that we don't expect patience from the youth anymore. And I think this is going to be exacerbated by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence encourages us to be impatient and careless.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so interesting to me because my wife is a writer and I've a fiction writer, and I've always seen like her colleagues, her classmates, her friends that write it, and they tend to write pretty. I mean, not long short stories, but there were traditional short stories, right? And the writers that have written flash fiction are usually like really specialized in that. Like occasionally they'll get some flash fiction published in like a regular, but typically they have like their own separate journals, their own separate prizes. That they
Yeah.
it's a very specific thing. And I wonder if what you're describing is one of the things that you said earlier, like maybe the appetite, maybe one of the early things that we'll see in AI is just that the appetite for like flash will increase um, a lot, and other longer forms will decrease some.
Yeah, we'll see. Because at the same time, the most popular like current trend right now is romanticy. And I know with those books, like, I was talking to a student of mine who decided to finally read Romanticy and because he's never shown much interest in it, but he checked out the Sarah Maas series. And he was telling me about how he had some trouble getting into it. And he said, well, I just have one part left. And then I was like, well, you're gonna finish the book soon. Just read one more chapter. And then he said, no, I finished like 7 books. And I have one more book left in the series. And I thought, okay, never mind. Maybe people do have a lot of patience if it's
Yeah, for the right stuff. Yeah.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
willing to consume like pages and pages and pages of, like Sarah J. Maas, Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah.
So we'll see. It's very contradictory, but who knows? Maybe again, since I'm looking at younger writers, younger students coming in with this, again, that trend could change. That's the thing about trends. They just flip on you.
Sure. Of course. Of course. And maybe once they progress in their maturity and their writing maturity, they will find that they need more space to convey the ideas that they have.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
So tell me one thing that I, have asked all of our guests, has been, our students are pretty young traditional students. Um, you're a very successful person. If somebody wanted to engage early in their career with kind of sci-fi or with writing in general, what advice would you have?
Oh gosh, it's very difficult to give advice because I think that it's such a personal choice, particularly when you decide to be a writer, you're deciding that you're not going to lead a life ruled by money. And this sounds very noble and lovely, but then in practice, it's very dangerous because we're increasingly, we live in a society that is trying to strip away basic protections
Mhm.
because it's too busy protecting the protections of the 1%.
Mhm.
So I feel that, when I started out as a writer, I started with a lot of ignorance about, the way the generations were changing, the way certain things were now going to be inaccessible to us. So I didn't really think much about money, as it was more of an abstract as opposed to the reality. But yes, like those are now the realities that will come in. And I think one of the first things I've noticed among my writer peers is that many of them don't have children.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because many of them don't have the stability or the financial security and the immense financial commitment you have to put into having children. And so those are sort of things that you have to now weigh. Like, what are you willing to sacrifice? And once you are able to really sit down and think about what you're willing to sacrifice or potentially sacrifice in your life, then you realize that your commitment is so, so strong and profound, and you should be proud of yourself for committing yourself to this path because it's going to be incredibly, there's going to be a lot that is out of your control. But the only thing that you have any say in is how much you love it and how
Mhm.
much you would not be able to exist, like exist as in meaningfully exist without it.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. Wonderful advice. Um, so, th- this has been 4 minutes. It's pretty much at the end. I'm wondering if you have any parting thoughts or anything else that we didn't touch on that you wish we had.
Well, I guess I'm curious about, since I'm coming at this from the perspective of an artist, what were some of the other industries? What were they saying about artificial intelligence, the impact of it now and later?
Yeah, so the for the most part, they said that one, a lot of the a lot of the jobs that are required today, there's not a clear path to replace them for
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, aside from the clerical work. So that clerical workers might be replaced early, and for non-clerical workers, they across industries, it seems like um, bureaucratic work. People are going to start using artificial intelligence more and more to do bureaucratic work, like for fill out pre-appointment forms or stuff like that. And then there was a little bit, there's also been some talk about things and worries about ethical concerns in terms of things like hallucinations and if you if I write a math paper and there's a there's a hallucination with a citation or whatever, I print an embarrassing retraction and that's it. 6 people read it. No one cares. Um, but if you're filing like an FDA paperwork to show safety, then a hallucination could not only defraud the government and the regulatory process, but has the potential also to, maybe produce adverse effects or even kill many people. And so we talked about how because a lot of industries have this standard of safety that's been built in over a couple centuries of what's really been bad choices. Um, it makes adopting AI to those procedures particularly difficult. And so for a lot of industries, at least for the immediate future, there's just not a path to replace most of the people that work there. And that's been pretty consistent across education and pharmaceutical and nursing. Um, so yeah, that's been most of it so far.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of our fears is about replacement, like being
Yes.
potentially rendered, non-productive. And
Yeah. Well, in capitalism, that is the worst fate that could happen to someone, right? Like to be rendered non-productive in a capitalist society is to be taken outside of that society. And
Yeah.
so I think I agree. I think our fear is very deeply, you know, it's very deeply tied to that, to being rendered unproductive.
Yeah, yeah. But at the same time, might be using AI to replace. So already you talked about therapists. I can imagine people starting to think, what if I can just use AI as an accountant?
Yeah.
If and then we take it a step forward where we now use AI to replace, emotional relationships, like romantic relationships. But or in the case of the avenue I really want to explore, what if we replaced children with AI, with robots?
Hmm.
And and if this is sort of the path we're headed towards, this replacement, and then industry professionals reassuring us that this replacement won't be possible, who's really to stop the companies from trying to make it possible?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Not me.
Yes. Are we ending on this very positive note?
Always, always. But thank you so much, Professor Park. I deeply appreciate you coming and talking with us today. I'm gonna go ahead and stop this.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope you and your students have a great discussion.